This is Update One, the podcast of the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. Update One provides a forum for listeners to learn about national and international stories, focusing on journalism and communication issues, news, and politics. Now, the latest edition of Update One.
I'm Adam Konowe, and joining me today is Scott Simmie. He's an award-winning and Emmy-nominated journalist based in Toronto. Scott's career included stints at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation and the Toronto Star before moving into technology communications for a variety of organizations. His newest venture is a podcast called Inside Stories, presented by the Bank of Montreal, or BMO for short. Welcome, Scott.
Thanks.
Let's start with the inspiration for your podcast, the COVID-19 pandemic. Arguably, Canada has had a much better outcome so far than the U.S. I mean, even adjusted for population, Canada has had fewer than half the number of infections and a mortality rate that I think is about a third lower. Why do you think that is?
I think our federal leadership, Prime Minister Trudeau, seemed to take it very seriously right from the get-go and made it very clear with a series of daily briefings that this was something we had to work on together as a nation. And so I think people understood that this was something very serious, and that if we did not kind of take all the measures that we could possibly take, that we would wind up with higher numbers. So I think just from the very outset, there was a tone established that this is a very serious moment, really, of national crisis, and everyone needs to do their part.
And Canada, like the U.S., is a federal system, albeit you have provinces and territories, whereas we have states. But what do you think has been sort of the story at the provincial and territorial level? I mean, I gather that there's been some parts of the country that have fared better than others.
There have been, and some of that may be because some of these provinces have lower population density than a province like Ontario, for example. But I think even these provinces that have conservative premiers, and of course Mr. Trudeau is from the Liberal Party, I think those premiers also realized that they needed to be on the same page with the federal government, and also, of course, that the federal government was going to be providing a lot of aid that would be distributed widely across the country. The figure that I've seen thrown around is that up to $300 billion with a B dollars has been committed to various wage subsidy, small business programs, and that is roughly 15% of our gross domestic product. So it's a huge amount of money, just as we've seen in the United States and elsewhere. But in this case, it seems that the premiers of the various provinces and territories also seem to just kind of get it that we needed to be on the same page.
Yeah. And the Prime Minister has continued his daily COVID-19 press conferences, unlike the White House, which wound them down under some scrutiny and criticism. How has the perception of Prime Minister Trudeau changed during this crisis, especially given that he now only leads a minority government in Canada?
Well, he has become more popular. His approval rating has gone up. I think the last number I saw was about 37%, which was, I believe, 6% higher than the Conservative Party. But there's no way really to capitalize on that, because we had an election last fall, so it's not like the Prime Minister would ever want to call an early election with a pandemic going on. But certainly his popularity has improved, and I think part of that too, without dissing the U.S. president, but I think many Canadians have been watching the news and seen what has unfolded from Mr. Trump, and when they compare our leader with the American president, certainly he's a lot more of a sort of an option that we'd be happier with at the moment.
Well, that's a good point, and I think it's something that's true of elections on both sides of the border, is that you can have opinions about a candidate, whether he or she is incumbent or a challenger in isolation, but then what you think of them in comparison to the choice you have or might have can then sway you perhaps one way or the other.
One of the interesting things that I've noted, I'm a big Twitter guy. I don't watch daily newscasts as much as I used to, and a lot of my information comes from trusted sources and news organizations on Twitter whom I follow. And one of the things that I've noticed here is that, for example, the Conservative Party leader in Canada has occasionally tried to take political potshots from the side on Twitter, for example, and invariably people sort of heap on and say, you know what, now is not the time. We have a crisis that we're dealing with, and it's not the time for this. So invariably, he seems to be getting shut down when he attempts to do that. And I think, I've seen him actually reduce how many of those sort of pot shots he's been taking. But it's very interesting to watch that unfold. And of course, part of that too is just Twitter's own algorithm, knowing that I'm a bit left-leaning, so it tends to feed me the responses that I might agree with.
Right. The other big story this year has been the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement and related civil rights protests in the face of often deadly acts of systemic racism by law enforcement and others. How has the topic of racism played out in Canada?
It's huge here. And in fact, we've seen a number of marches, peaceful protests. Thankfully, we have not seen any of the rioting that happened in some of the earlier events. But it has taken, certainly it has caught the public attention here in Canada as well. And, quite rightly so, because there is certainly systemic racism in Canada, both anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous. There are many groups who could come forward and produce evidence that they have been discriminated against in Canada. So we've seen already a commitment from the Prime Minister, from many of the people in power, an acknowledgement that this is an issue and the time has come to deal with it here as well. I think, sometimes people, even Canadians, like to think, it's this gentle, calm, polite country where, everything goes well. But when it comes to systemic racism, we have an issue here in Canada. And, with the death of George Floyd and that horrific video that so many of us have seen, it really triggered something here as well. And I suspect we're going to see long-term changes in this country.
Yeah, it really is remarkable how the topic has accelerated from, even a visual perspective. So we're here at the Broadcast Operations Center of the National Press Club in the middle of Washington, 2 blocks from the White House on Juneteenth, and all of the roads in this part of the city are blockaded by police and National Guard vehicles. Storefronts are boarded up. It's the security cordon is effectively a lockdown except for official vehicles and pedestrians. Let's turn to your podcast, Inside Stories, presented by the Bank of Montreal. What is its premise, and why did you feel it would sort of fill a gap in what is becoming an increasingly crowded realm of podcasts?
It's a long story, but the Coles Notes version is twofold. One is that my background was broadcast initially. I started working in radio when I was in high school. So, I've kind of been around the medium since I was about 15, off and on. And part of my career was at CBC, as you mentioned. And while working at CBC, one of my colleagues who became a good friend eventually left the CBC, and he became the head of marketing at BMO. And he knew that I was still working in communications and media, and he reached out to me soon after the pandemic began and said, hey, what do you think? Do you think we could maybe pull together a podcast that is not about the bank, that's not about personal finance, but is really about, how people are coping with the pandemic? And I said, sure, let me think about that for a day. And so we chatted again the next day, and I said, yeah, let's try and do this. And the concept really was to find out how people's lives have changed with the pandemic. And I don't just mean in terms of being locked down and watching more Netflix, but whether they're looking at life differently, whether their work life has changed. And the goal was to see if we could come up with some stories that might kind of, inspire or even just entertain and inform, but hopefully from time to time we might come across a topic that would really elevate it and take it a little further. So one of the people I interviewed, for example, is named Gurdeep Pander, and he was originally from India, and he lives now in Yukon, just outside of Whitehorse. And he is a Bhangra dancer. He teaches people this particular dancing style, and he has a number of viral videos out there. And he has continued to do that during the pandemic with virtual classes instead of teaching people in person. And he has found that people who want to do this, learn this dance style, find that they're getting a lot of joy out of it. But beyond that, he had a really interesting philosophy about life and about sort of the fact that all human beings are equal. And he described it in such an eloquent way that I'm not even coming close to here, and I'm not even going to attempt. But it really was a positive message at a time when things are difficult. And so I remember after we, pulled that podcast together, I thought, he had something valuable to say here that I think would be valuable for listeners. And I've had a couple of other ones where that has been the case as well. So I think hopefully, yes, we're trying to tell these stories. We're trying to introduce the listener to interesting people from across North America, but also elevate it beyond just a basic narrative.
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed that episode in particular. His enthusiasm and sense of self-grounding was really quite remarkable and infectious, and also what an amazing statement for diversity. Someone with his background and living in Yukon, not Toronto or Montreal as one perhaps stereotypically might presume, and has taken his love for this dance into so many places, including the Canadian military, which was just really fun to watch the videos of that on YouTube and elsewhere.
Well, it's been interesting, too, to be working on this project as these events are unfolding in North America, but obviously in the U.S. in particular. For example, a couple of weeks ago, I spoke with an African-American actor who has been in a number of movies. His name is Lamorne Morris, and we were able to broach that topic about Black Lives Matter and what it meant to him, and this whole idea of systemic racism, the fact that he'd been out participating in protests, and it gave him an opportunity to discuss something he normally wouldn't talk about in his career, and it gave me an opportunity to really understand more about what it might be like to be a person who has lived with that kind of systemic discrimination.
I want to come back to that, but you've talked to, and I think you've released about 8 episodes to date, and a couple of them have featured fellow journalists. Among those chosen was Peter Mansbridge, the legendary former anchor of the National, CBC's flagship nightly newscast. He's somebody who I gather is known to you and now safely retired. He didn't mince words.
No, he didn't. I used to work with Peter, and so, I thought of him kind of immediately when we were kicking off the series. And no, he did not. Peter does a podcast now, and so he's also still very much on top of the news. And he certainly expressed his kind of surprise at how the U.S. president has been behaving and kind of the lack of leadership that we've seen. He didn't go into great detail, but by what he said, you could tell he was certainly not a fan. And that's not a position, of course, Peter would have been able to express when he was the anchor of the national newscast, but feels comfortable in doing in retirement or quasi-retirement. So yes, he certainly did have that to say, and he was also quite a fan, he pointed out, of Angela Merkel and how she has been handling things in her country.
You also spoke to Jacqueline Charles. She's the Caribbean correspondent for the Miami Herald. She had a lot to say about the recent protests and COVID-19 and and even the importance of neutrality in journalism. What did you take away from that interview?
I took away a lot. I've always been a fan of Jacqueline's work. She was in Haiti, I believe, for like 18 months after that devastating earthquake, and was, I believe, one of the first journalists on the ground there after it happened. But I was struck by her dedication to this story. Normally, Jacqueline would be jumping on airplanes and traveling to these places that she reports on, but of course with COVID-19, that has become very difficult to do. So now she is in a position where she is, working the phones. She is monitoring radio on the internet, listening to one of the newscasts she mentioned is in Creole, and working all of her sources every day to try, despite these barriers and obstacles, to still get a picture of all these countries and what's happening in those places. And of course, she's trying to cover the countries themselves as well as what's happening with the pandemic. So if there's a really significant event that is outside of the pandemic, she is still trying to keep her eye on that as well. And I was just struck by, the real true dedication that we see in journalists we admire. I mean, all of us like to think we were dedicated or are dedicated as journalists, but always you run into some people who just care so deeply about what they do that even if their personal lives are kind of put on hold so that they can do that work, that's what they choose to do. And certainly I saw that and heard that in the conversation with Jacqueline. I asked her at one point, I said, so, man, it sounds like you work so hard. What's your work-life balance like? And she said, I don't have a home life right now. It's all work. But she didn't sound bitter about that. She loves what she does, and she does such a fantastic job as a journalist.
Well, and I think that's one of the messages of some of the other episodes as well. And without giving anything away, I think there is a thread that you've managed to tie together here among guests who are in such different careers and of different backgrounds that have a connection back to balance and mental health.
Yes, and I have a background in the mental health world. I've co-authored a couple of books about mental health, nonfiction, obviously. So it's been an area that interests me. And when I hear, an opening in an interview where I might be able to take it further and touch on some of those issues, or just touch on something that I think is useful and deeper than day-to-day conversation, I try to go there where possible. And the other day, and I don't want to give this away either, but the other day it was actually a guest who surprised me. Now, this guest has a very interesting job, a very successful career, and I follow this person on Twitter, and that's really about all I knew about her. And it's a funny aside, because normally when I'm going to interview someone, like any journalist, I will try to do my research and learn as much as I can about them to see if there might be a little tidbit or grain here and there that is worth asking about. And in this case, I did not have time to research this woman's background. And so I went into it kind of cold. I had prepared a list of questions, sort of general questions, but there we were. So we're carrying out the interview, and this person is very accomplished in terms of doing an interview. She had wonderful answers, very eloquent, to the point. And as I looked at my list of questions, I thought, holy cow, I might run out of questions here. So I was listening very, very carefully to see if there might be something that she dropped that I could return to. And early on, I asked her, I said, listen, you speak from time to time. Who do you speak for, and what do you speak about? And one of the things she said was, well, there are times when I speak about adversity that I've overcome, and other times about the accomplishments of my career. And so as I was hitting that point of running out of questions, I said, early on, you said something about overcoming adversity. And I said, I'm wondering if there's just one particular thing that you're comfortable sharing that you could tell us about. And she then launched into a story that was about 5 minutes long and actually left me in tears, because it was so giving and it was such a deeply, deeply personal story. And there was also a message there that I felt instantly could be useful for other people. And so for me, it was actually one of the highlights of the journalistic work that I've done throughout my career, was just having this conversation the other day and having this person trust me enough to tell me that story. As I heard it unfold, I could barely believe it, and I could barely believe how giving this person was. So that was a real high point for me.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I will not say anything more about it other than to encourage listeners of this podcast to subscribe to yours, to listen to that episode. I believe it's episode 7, but they're all great, and really get an appreciation for the transparency and authenticity of that moment. I mean, that's exactly what great journalism should be about. Journalists aren't the only ones affected by the current lockdown, and you also work on the communication side, the technology communication side, and many of the listeners of this podcast and members of the National Press Club are communicators rather than journalists. And I guess I'm sort of curious about what your message is to them, especially in times of crisis, about communicating, having now served on both sides of the fence.
I think for me, the message is, it's a word actually you used just a minute ago, which was authenticity. Coming from a journalism background and without really any formal, marketing and communications training, to me, it's important to tell the truth. Obviously, if we're working in communications, we may want to highlight certain value propositions, et cetera. But I think in the end, people have become very sophisticated when they're reading content. And I think they know immediately if something feels like marketing speak, if it feels like we're trying to persuade them. And so I always take the approach that we need to simply tell the truth and look for the points that we want to emphasize, but do so really in kind of a journalistic fashion. And that has certainly worked for clients that I have worked with, and it's been the approach that I'll continue to take, because it just resonates. It feels authentic because it is. Yeah.
It's certainly a message that I share with my PR students at American University here in Washington. And I think an extra challenge with you is a lot of the communications that you do relates to emerging technologies, things like unmanned aerial vehicles, where nobody really knows yet what is 100% real or viable, and there's a lot of players out there jockeying for position, right?
Absolutely. And it's a very competitive space. That field of unmanned aerial vehicles is growing so rapidly. And in fact, it's an area that I knew I wanted to move into when I left journalism. Again, I think, if you want to stand out in a very noisy, crowded room, clear, clean, and authentic messaging, it will really help you do it.
Well, coming back to your podcast and to wrap up, I know that you always finish with your guests with a lightning round of short Q&A using a sound that I'm going to try to replicate, that's something like this. I may not have done that loud enough. Did it come through? Oh, good. So that is a table knife against a glass, a drinking glass, and that signifies the beginning of I was going to say but really your lightning round. So quick questions, quick answers. Scott, what has been your favorite story to cover and why?
The student demonstrations in Tiananmen Square in 1989, because it was so big. It was powerful, there was passion, and it was just unforgettable. I've never seen anything like it before. I never will again. Mm.
What event in history do you wish you could have witnessed?
I would have liked to see the Berlin Wall fall. I was watching it on television from CBC National Newsroom, and I really wanted to be there.
Do you have a preferred microphone or brand as somebody who spends a lot of time behind one?
Yes, I am a recent convert to AKG, and I'm using something called a C414 XL2. I hope I've got that right, but it's a lovely microphone. It's a great condenser microphone.
And last, post-COVID, presuming all gets back to some form of new normal, Raptors, Leafs, Blue Jays, Toronto FC, or Argonauts?
Raptors, 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 Raptors.
Outstanding. Scott, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Adam. Really appreciate it.
Toronto-based Scott Simmie is the host of BMO or BMO Inside Stories, a podcast available through your favorite podcast app. For Update 1, I'm Adam Konowe.
Update 1 is a production of the National Press Club's Broadcast Podcast Committee. You can comment on this podcast or any episode of Update 1 by sending an email to update1podcast, that's update the number 1 podcast, @gmail.com. Thanks for listening to Update 1.